So welcome everybody to Wemcast. You're here with me, Eoin Walker, and I've got a colleague and friend with me today, Beth Moos. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. Beth, just for listeners and or viewers, could you just give us a bit of background on you, just where you come from and what you're up to, what you're doing now?
Sure. So I'm currently a GP trainee in my final year, so ST3 year, and I've been qualified as a doctor for about coming up to 7 years, and sort of done a few different things and taken a bit of time out of training, spending time abroad and doing a bit of expedition medicine, doing a bit of global health, tropical medicine, and my particular interest I've sort of found over the last sort of 4 years or so is snakebite. So that's what I've been doing a bit more work on and hope to do a bit more in the future as well.
Indeed. Awesome. Excellent. So just looking into some of your background, Beth, and some of your expedition experience. So I know you spent quite a lot of time in sort of Southeast Asia, amongst other places. And when you were there, was the majority of case mix around snakebite, or was it quite a vast case mix that you were seeing?
Well, I suppose each of the trips and things I've done have sort of varied quite a lot. So there've been some trips where I've gone out and supported a group that's come from the UK and gone out, and so you see a sort of a variety of things that you have to deal with, based on people's pre-existing medical conditions, with a sprinkle of things that you come across on your way around. And in terms of snakebite, I sort of focused on that when I was in Myanmar, when I spent 7 months there. Otherwise, it's been a mixture of expedition medicine things and sort of common things that you might expect to see on expedition.
Indeed. And so your experience on expedition, as sort of being a generalist, would you generally find you'd have to put your hand to a lot of different sort of both medical and non-medical facets of the expedition, of sorts, be a generalist, in essence?
Yeah, I think having that sort of background and training in general practice actually stands you in very good stead. And that, I think, and experience in being in the emergency department are really important things to have, because you just sort of get hit with anything and everything, as I'm sure you're aware, and right from psychological issues to GI problems, whatever it is. There's a real mixture across the spread, sexual health, and I think both working in general practice and in the emergency department, you have I suppose you feel a bit more comfortable in dealing with that uncertainty and what do I need to do now, what can I sort of leave till later, and sort of approach, I suppose.
Absolutely. So I see you also spent some time in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. So you've also spent time in Malawi, I believe.
Malawi is coming up, hopefully in September. So this is, yes. So we'll see. That's very much the hope, but obviously uncertain times at the moment. So I am preparing as if I am going, but we'll have to see.
Yeah. So this is in the midst of the current climate and the current pandemic. So what do you find yourself doing now on a day-to-day level, Beth? What's your sort of day-to-day look like at the moment?
Yeah, well, general practice has completely changed, and I'm sure everyone would say the same. So our sort of workload has actually dramatically dropped. People are just not getting in touch with us, and I think it might be for a variety of different reasons. People, I think, potentially are worried about coming into contact with healthcare professionals and mixing with other people, understandably, at this concerning time. I think some people think that they can't go and see their GP because they think that their practices are shut and are not able to see people. But we're doing a lot of work over the telephone now and using a lot more technology where we can. So it's been a steep learning curve, but it's one I think that we'll be able to learn a lot from and use again in the future. So we're trying to do things like we are now. So using video links, photographs. We've got this e-consult system that we were using in the past anyway, which is actually really helpful, where you can just go through a list of questions, fill things in, attach photos, and it's working reasonably well, I think. But we are still seeing people, of course, if we need to, but with the precautions that have obviously been advised. But as I mentioned before, we have just started to set up these community sort of COVID clinics, which have started. Well, our one has started on Monday. So we're seeing, a trickle of patients coming through, but it's been useful to have a bit of time to sort of set that up, work through some teething problems, practice some sort of scenarios, and prepare.
Indeed. It sounds. You're right. The evolution of actual general practice sounds like it in the current climate sounds like it's very much shifted pace, as it has in the pre-hospital climate. Actually, having just done 3 day shifts and 3 night shifts, we're now seeing fundamentally a lot more cardiac arrests, and a lot. I think a lot of the younger paramedics are exposed to a lot more cardiac arrests. The average paramedic sees a cardiac arrest once every 6 months to a year, and they're now seeing one a shift, really. So there is an aggregation of critical care within the general population of clinicians, actually, and I think that's definitely a shift for us. So I think we're seeing across domains quite a shift in case mix, actually, which is interesting.
I was just going to say, in your opinion, then, having seen more of these arrests, do you think it's people presenting late and not going to seek help?
Interestingly, I do, actually. Very interesting question, actually, Beth. A couple of answers to that question is, one is that relatives aren't allowed to hospital. So what we've generally found a couple of times, actually, is that patients are a lot more reluctant to go into hospital without their relative support. But what we're actually seeing is a representation, more acutely so, if not indeed almost in cardiac arrest. Well, some cases whereby they probably should have gone in the first time, irrespective of a relative coming in with them. So that seems to interweave and play into play quite a lot. And then more so as well with just the outplay of the actual disease process, so that the almost the pathology itself seems to, in the second week of the fruition of the pathology, seems to get worse. So between day 7 and day 10 is the real turning point as to whether people improve or deteriorate. And if they do deteriorate, what we're generally finding is that's quite a quick process. So we either catch them or don't. But we're seeing a lot more critical care patients as a general population of paramedics, which is quite worrying, actually.
It is. It's sort of adapting, isn't it, to that sort of what is quite an unknown disease, really, with very limited information. As you say, all these people who on the phone sound okay, they don't sound too short of breath. You stick a SATS probe on, and actually they're really sick, and it's you're sort of having to adapt your what you would have normally done, I think, and changing that.
Absolutely. I'd be interested to see what your experience is, because what I am seeing is that some of the common characteristics are that the chronic respiratory pathologies such as asthma, actually diabetes, interestingly enough, but asthma, COPD, and these kind of chronic respiratory pathologies seem to be very much exacerbated by coronavirus, and I definitely do see a correlation. Are you seeing that in general practice as well?
I honestly haven't really at the moment. I think we haven't seen enough cases. As I said, last week I saw 2 patients face to face. The rest of it was telephone. So we're just not at the moment seeing many patients at all. And I think as we do more work in the COVID clinic, and as there are more cases, then maybe I'll be able to come back to you with another answer.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. So Beth, let's just pivot slightly and look at a couple of things that you've not only done but taken interest in. So you mentioned snakebite before, and just before we recorded this, we were talking about some of the attributes of public health and public health messages that we advocate, both in a pandemic and when I've been in places like Costa Rica or Southeast Asia on expedition, and same for you, that you advocate these public health messages to sort of stop the prevalence of snakebite. How much do you think that correlates and kind of bears relevance in this current climate at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, isn't it? And I think you mentioned public health, and for me, whether it's snake bite or just preparing to go on an expedition or preparing for anything, it's that word, it's the preparing part. And I think we are sort of slightly limited in this, what's going on at the moment. Things are moving so quickly, things are changing every day, new guidelines and things, but I think it's all about the preparation and the planning. As you say, the public health measures are key. You know, the things we're being told all the time, don't go out, stay at home, they're so important. And it's just, as we all know, the prevention is so much better than cure, and trying to sort out the mess down the end, later down the line.
Absolutely. So just looking at, just doing a bit of a deep dive into snake bites a little bit, because it fascinates me actually as a clinician. I've only dealt with 2 snake bites in my time, but very much have to interact on a yearly basis whenever I go into this environment to teach and or lead expeditions. So from a prevalence point of view, are we still seeing the pinch points to be, I guess, Southeast Asia and or Central America across that region? I know the majority of your experience is Southeast Asia. Is that
Yeah,
right?
that's right. Yeah, as I say, Africa is to come, but certainly sub-Saharan Africa is a lot of snakebite there. Southeast Asia, absolutely. Looking towards the Americas, Central America, you're right in saying is where the incidence is highest. I think Panama, as far as I recall, is the highest incidence country over there. But yes, it's still a problem for many places, and one of the parts of the problem is just not having that data to say, you know, what is the current state of play. You know, for a lot of places it's a best guess. We're using hospital data, and we're missing all of the people who, you know, might experience snake bite, and for whatever reason, either they don't seek medical help or they never make it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I've realized as well is the prevalence of still sometimes, heavily reliant on agricultural processes and or just heavily agricultural societies actually that are still embedded within that environment and rely on that for as a matter of produce and or income, which is where fundamentally snakes live, have their habitat, and are living. So I guess the prevalence is around the exposure,
Yeah.
and this being so. Just pivoting slightly and looking at, so they're interesting, they're sort of interesting um, species really, because they're highly adapted in their environments. So looking at sort of the nocturnal rather than the diurnal aspect of snakes. Some snakes obviously do operate in the daytime, but
Mm.
looking at the stereoscopic eyes, the slits rather than most of the slits rather than the spherical pupils necessarily, but also the way that they sense vibration through the mandible and through their bones, their heat seeking, or indeed they thermal image, so they see heat as an image. The fact that they can smell through their tongue, and that they are finely attuned to both movement and or heat. I think one thing that my revelations, and it'd be interesting to get your thoughts, is that they are a finely attuned evolutionary species of sorts, or indeed type of creature, and I think also just trying to pick them out from the environment very much represents that point, that they're so well, the way that they their color, their skin patterns, almost you can almost be walking on a path, and it can be right next to your leg, and you can't pick it, you can't differentiate it from the environment. Is that your experience as well?
So I haven't seen, unfortunately, because I would have loved to, seen lots of snakes in the wild, because you miss them. You just see a little, and something's just disappeared, a little rustle, and you see a tail or something. But yes, certainly, I totally agree. They're fascinating animals, and the more I learn, the more sort of interesting I find it. And yes, they can vary sort of hugely, even between one snake over the course of its own lifetime. Its venom can vary. The venom sort of composition can vary between individuals of the same species, and you might have the same species that, for example, in Myanmar might differ to the one seen in another country. And even in geographical location in the country as well. So, for example, in Myanmar, where I've been recently, they noticed that down in the Delta area, they just see a lot more severe envenomings. I'm not quite sure why that is, but it's something about those group of snakes that have sort of changed and evolved in a certain way, perhaps. But yeah, no, it's fascinating, and yeah, they're very difficult to spot, aren't they?
Incredibly so. So just looking at the broad brush classification of envenomations, or indeed just the venom types, or indeed what they do, how would we classify them, so to speak?
So it's I suppose on a very sort of simple level, and it's not obviously that simple in real life, but you've got snakes that generally or broadly will affect your blood clotting. So you'll get a consumption coagulopathy, use up your clotting factors, and then be left with incoagulable blood. And then you might expect to see sort of bleeding, spontaneously bleeding from potentially the bite site or various other places, nose, mouth. And then you've got the neurotoxic envenomings, where you might expect to see someone sometimes quite rapidly progress down to sort of respiratory paralysis and then inevitably cardiac arrest. But then you've got other, again, it depends on the species, and some particular species, you'll notice quite a sort of cytotoxic picture and a lot of necrosis over the bite site. And I think it's understanding, again, what is that normal, what would you expect to see for that snake and with that venom, which will help you, if you are the receiving clinician, to know what's going on. Because sometimes when people get bitten, they do bring in a dead snake, occasionally alive, but mostly dead. And that's really helpful in terms of species identification to get an appropriate antivenom, if of course there is one. But often you'll get a patient in and you won't know what species is responsible. So that is really helpful to try and sort of target your treatment.
Absolutely, absolutely. Why snakebite specifically? I might have already asked this in a roundabout way. Why did it trigger your kind of enthusiasm or interest?
Yeah, I often get asked that question because being in a general practice, the link between snakebite and general practice is not always obvious. But I did the diploma in tropical medicine in Liverpool in 2016. And we, at the end of it, or coming towards the end, we had a tour of the hepatarium there where they have all the snakes. And I was just looking at the wall. I happened to notice a poster and it said Professor David Worrell. And I was just chatting with the person who was giving the tour. And I was about to move to Oxford and it said David Worrell, Oxford. And this chap said, oh, well, David Worrell is actually coming here next week to talk on the snakebite module. Perhaps you should meet him if you're interested. So I went back and Googled him, and he'd obviously done a lot of work on snakebite and amongst many other things. And he actually lives in Headington in Oxford, which is where I was living at the time. I'm now just around the corner. So we met briefly. We met up in Headington, and then things sort of spiraled from there. And as I said before, the more I learned, the more interested I became.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And I think you're right. If you're around like-minded people that are very passionate about a topic, it can become increasingly more fascinating. Having dealt with recipients of snake bites in the past, whereby it's happened in their past and they talk about it and recite it, I find it hugely fascinating. And more so just because first-hand experience counts for a lot actually as well. And what I realized quite early on is that a lot of these bites are intramuscular bites, and akin to giving an intramuscular injection. If I was to give intramuscular adrenaline, I would hope to see the effects of it after about 30 seconds to a minute. And actually talking to some of these people that are bitten by snakes, if it is indeed an envenomed bite, they feel the effects almost instantaneously. One of the people we work with in Costa Rica, he said he could feel the venom traveling up his body to the point he had a pounding headache and started to vomit, but very much felt the effects of the envenomation almost
Yeah.
instantaneously. And it's interesting actually, because we have all these temporizing measures, bandage distally to proximally, keep a window where the bite is, maybe draw something around it to see if there's any swelling, or indeed, but actually the symptomatology will show itself actually quite quickly.
Well, that's not always the case, actually. But yes, I think a lot of the time that could well be, and certainly if you've got a neurotoxic picture, sometimes you can get quite a rapid deterioration. But there was a well-known herpetologist called Joe Slowinski, and he was out, and I think he was given a bag with a snake in, and he was told by someone that this is a non-venomous species. So he sort of looked, put his hand in, grabbed it, it bit him, and he looked at it and said, "Oh, this is a crate." Put it back in, and for whatever reason, I don't know the full details, he didn't go and seek help. They, as a team, stayed where they were in what was quite a remote area. And I think it was only sort of many hours later that he then sort of felt a bit of a tingling around the bite site, and then he knew what was going to happen. So he sort of pulled his team together and said, this is what is going to happen. I will become less conscious. I won't be able to move. And then at some point I will stop breathing. And when I do, this is how you need to take over breathing for me. And they called to get a helicopter in. But that was actually, interestingly, the same day as 9/11 happened. And I don't know how big a part that played in the sort of medevac, casevac scenario or not. But, by the time the help arrived, it was too late, sadly. But it just, I think it just sort of shows that, regardless of where you are, what you think, if there's a bite from the snake, you need to take the appropriate measures, as you mentioned, and go to seek help.
Yeah, absolutely. And even the dry bites, you like you were saying, you can't necessarily quality assure they are dry bites at the time. Just to your point there, it can take minutes and or hours to take effect, which is a really valid point actually, around always seeking help, regardless of whether you think it might be a dry bite and or not. Okay, so just pivoting and bringing that back to the current climate around sort of this, something we notioned towards earlier, Beth, around sort of this invisible, this almost like invisible pathogen or invisible danger, which you don't necessarily perceive until it's upon you. How are we currently seeing the death rate rise within the coronavirus cohort, and as this pandemic starts to proliferate and come to fruition, in your mind, how important are the preventative measures, and or public health messages? Do you see good adherence to them, and do you think people are taking them to heart as important messages?
I think, from my experience locally, I think people probably are adhering to the rules. Obviously, we've all seen things in the news like Snowdon having its busiest day. Was it Mother's Day that weekend? So I think obviously then, there will always be people, whatever the circumstances, who won't, for whatever reasons, take the appropriate advice. But you're absolutely right. I think these messages are key, and this is, what the government keeps saying, isn't it? This is the way that we will stop the spread. It's really difficult, but we just need to stay apart from each other, don't we? And take sensible precautions. Yeah.
Absolutely. And have you seen the outplay of any mental health issues as a result of sort of social distancing or a lack of social interaction?
I think probably if you asked anyone, they'd be able to, feedback from that they, on an individual level, will have had experienced some sort of anxiety, and I think that would be completely normal, wouldn't it? But certainly those who have a pre-existing mental health problem or already have health anxieties, then you can completely understand, can't you, why this would be a particularly worrying time. Yeah, for sure. So, and we've certainly had a lot of calls and queries about coronavirus and what that means for people on an individual level, and what changes, how do they get whatever it is they need. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so looking at some of your past works, Beth, around sort of snake bite. It's not only snake bite that you've looked at as well. You've looked at some of the pathology around HIV transmission. Is that correct? Around HIV?
That was just a sort of a fairly sort of low key project that when I did was in primary care a few years ago, just looking at HIV testing and what the rates testing rates were within the practice and compared to what they should be.
Yeah.
Because within Oxford city centre, we actually classify as a high prevalence area. So what that means for general practice actually is that we should be testing everyone on an opt-out basis when you sign up to register. But I think HIV is a fascinating disease, and there's a lot of sort of, it's not that new anymore evidence, but I think a lot of people are still unaware of what we call indicator conditions. So, for example, community-acquired pneumonia is one of them, where if you have community-acquired pneumonia, then you should really get a HIV test. And I think for the most part that is probably not happening. But there are lots of other of these conditions which have an association with HIV. So looking back retrospectively, when they've taken people who've had a new diagnosis, looking back, they've been able to say, you presented with condition A, B, C, and actually potentially we could have picked this up earlier. So that's how they sort of come to those outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I know testing's being very much in the news recently with coronavirus as well, and some of my colleagues have commented around the utility of swabbing and the prevalence of sort of false negatives actually. So swabbing the nasopharynx instead of the oropharynx or hypopharynx can almost give a false negative. It just depends where the pathogen's actually sitting in the body.
Right.
Have you found sort of testing within either general practice or within some of your colleagues' circles to be an issue, and or some of the sort of swabbing tests?
You mean with coronavirus?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So we still are unable to offer people tests. As far as I'm aware, it's only recently happened in Oxford area where people are able to get it to healthcare workers through occupational health, or if you're in a GP practice through that route. So we're still, even in the COVID clinic, not able to test people who we suspect might have it. Yeah. So hopefully that will change.
Absolutely. So just digging down into your past somewhat as well, Beth, and just looking at some of the things you've done. So I can see you've not only just been looking at snake bites in the past, but also you've got you've delivered some sort of first aid courses as well within snakebite, but also within the community in Southeast Asia and or Myanmar. Have you found that have you had any feedback as to how those have been, or have they been received well in the past?
Yeah, so I'll have to correct you slightly and say that I sort of helped organise but didn't actually deliver myself, because although I managed to get some command over the Burmese language, it certainly wasn't adequate enough to be delivering teaching. So what we did was, so I'd basically been involved in making some posters about snakebite prevention, first aid, what not to do, because a lot of people are using some inappropriate traditional treatments for snakebite as well, which can cause a lot of harm. For example, cutting to try and release the venom, and then the patient ended up getting tetanus, for example. So we actually found this school that was especially for farmers or young farming students, where they were taking people from remote and rural areas, doing either a 3-month or a 6-month course looking at sort of different farming techniques. The idea being they'd take that knowledge then back to their communities. So I thought this would be perfect to do some work on snakebite with, because as you've mentioned already, these are the people who are going to be at risk of snakebite. So we actually linked up with the Red Cross, Burmese Red Cross, gave them the posters and all the info. Sort of, my colleague who is Burmese was able to speak to them about what we were trying to do, what the information was, and then they went and delivered that session to that sort of farming group of students. And I think they're going to be incorporating that now into their curriculum each time. So hopefully each batch of students that come through will get that information, and then be someone in their community that knows actually this is what we should do. We should get help. And it's not quite that simple, is it though? In terms of changing health cultures, health beliefs, but I think it's hopefully a start.
Yeah, indeed it is. Indeed it is. So just also looking at some of the things you've done around healthcare leadership, and or indeed courses that you've been on, and areas of interest. If you were to sort of look at some of the just leadership within your own practice and or healthcare domain, what would you advocate for staff at the moment going through, albeit quite a very difficult time? From a leadership and or self care perspective, is there anything you would want people to sort of be mindful of in this time?
Yeah. I think that's it's a really important point, isn't it? And having good leadership is critical at a time like this, and being able to have people who are that focusing on care and looking after people as well is a really important part of that, rather than just the latest guidance and things like that. And it's a really important part of being able to work together well as a team, and a functional team at that. And it's certainly something that I was thinking about all the different things that we've learned from expedition medicine and various different experiences, and how that would translate and what we can take from that and put forward. So some of the things that we've tried to do in our practice, one of the things I suggested, and I did with myself with a colleague as well, is something that I'd done in Borneo. And we sort of sat down, myself and my now friend, Tina, and we sort of went through a series of questions before we actually went out on our expedition. And we didn't know each other too well at the time, so that was actually quite helpful to do. And it was things along the lines of, if I become unwell, how would I like to be treated? And in the same vein, to translating that through to general practice, if I become stressed and anxious, how will I behave? How will I feel? And what might make me feel better? So I sat down with a colleague, and we sort of spoke through that together, because I think that's a really useful thing to think about in advance. And it not only helps someone else to recognise, so and so is not, maybe not having the best day, but it also helps you to think about that as well, and have a bit of insight into, oh yes, maybe I am, not doing as well as I thought I was, and actually yes, I remember that I said this might make me feel a bit better, so I'll go and have a bath, or whatever it is, or speak to a friend, something like that. So that's one thing that I've done and sort of suggested to others.
Mm.
Another thing is a bit of humour as well, which I think is important at a time like this.
Yeah.
So what we've done is we have our daily lunchtime meeting where we bring everyone together, and I've got a box of cheese jokes, which was given to me by another group of colleagues when I left, which probably says a lot about me, doesn't it? So we've got this stack of cheese jokes, and we're passing it around, and at the end of the meeting, someone reads out a joke, which is very poor humour, but mildly amusing, and it just helps to sort of lighten the mood, bring a bit of light relief to what is sometimes quite a heavy conversation.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. I think that tempered approach is absolutely key, actually, of getting the right balance between being serious enough to take it seriously, but having a little bit of lighthearted banter as well. Absolutely. So, Beth, I'm led to believe am I right in thinking you speak four languages, or is it five? Four languages.
So French, some German, a bit less Spanish, and then some Burmese, which has sort of dwindled somewhat.
Yeah, fantastic. And is that from living in all those countries, or is that just as you've gone along, you've taken interest in those languages?
So I did French for A level. I did German GCSE. My mum is reasonably good at German, and so we often have the German radio on back at home. Yeah. So keep a little bit of a hand in that, and then spent some time in Panama, so picked up some medical Spanish and useful things during my time there. And then Burmese, yes, from living in Myanmar.
Yeah, indeed. Fantastic. I suppose I'll labour that point only because it's actually quite rare to have a multilingual clinician these days. I certainly I'm not multilingual. I know a bit of Spanish, but certainly not really enough to have a medical consultation. But I think that's really when you take it to the next level, when you can have you can orchestrate a medical consultation in another language where when you can extrapolate bits back.
Yeah, it's you certainly can get a lot, but I think you inevitably won't get all those sort of subtle communication bits which are so sometimes so important, especially for less of an issue for maybe a GI problem, but all those other sort of mental health. Even in English, it's a bit of an art, isn't it? So yeah.
Absolutely.
But I think
So just,
certainly wherever you are, if you make a sort of an effort to, people do really appreciate that, don't they?
so absolutely, absolutely. So Beth, looking at just communication, because I think you're right, it's so fundamental at the moment in this current climate, both interpersonal communication with colleagues, but and also with patients. Um, when you're doing medical consultations, I guess face to face, very much so. Are you wearing PPE at that time, or are you not wearing PPE? Are you wearing a PF2 mask or a surgical mask at that time?
Yeah. So what we're trying to do is most of all the chit chat is done on the phone, and then we're trying to minimise that sort of face to face contact. So any chat is on the phone, and we will explain. Then what will happen is I will come out to the car park and I'll be all masked and gloved and gowned, so not to be alarmed. And then yes, you bring people through, do your examination, get them back out again, and then you can call them again for any further sort of chit chat, just to try and minimise that risk. But yes, even just having a mask over your face is, you do have a different sort of interaction with people. You can't see people's facial expressions. For some people that's really important. For example, if you rely on lip reading to communicate, if you can't hear, and what I've done as well is I've made a little another badge which I is a nice plastic one that I can wipe down at the end of between each patient's as well. But this has got a picture of my face on it, so people can see what I do actually look like,
Yeah.
just to make it slightly less, I don't unpersonal, I
Well,
suppose.
you make a great point, actually, though, Beth. You can't really see each other's faces. I was on shift last night and the last few nights, and it's only when everyone takes the PPE off you think, gosh, actually, now how important nonverbal communication is, which is completely removed by PPE, and can feel actually very impersonal in between colleagues, let alone patient
Yeah.
facing, which is vital. Actually, it's absolutely vital to maintain as much as possible. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
So
and also how much you might rely on a bit of touch as well,
yeah,
uh,
indeed. Yeah,
and then it's rather natural, doesn't it, to not be able to touch someone.
it's bizarre. Yeah, absolutely bizarre. Absolutely bizarre. Absolutely bizarre. So, Beth, just to come in to land on a few things, really, because it's just fascinating to get your points and perspectives. So, to the WEM community listening or watching this, do you have any sort of fundamental message you'd like to convey to people just around the current climate and challenges facing them, just in the way of encouragement?
Yeah. So I suppose what I would say is, we've all got different backgrounds and we've all got different experiences. And that there'll be loads that you will have learned through those. So I think, having a bit of time to reflect about, what you've done, what you have learned, and what you think you might be able to translate into what's going on at the moment. And I think, we all can play a big part in that sort of resilience, teamwork, looking after each other, which is so so important at a time like this. So you doesn't matter if you've never left the UK. You can still make a big difference by looking out for not only yourself but also the people around you, which is huge. So you've got to remember that I think this is different to going abroad. For example, going out to manage an Ebola crisis. That's very different because you're going out. You've thought about this. You've spoken to your family and friends with like-minded people. There's a plan. There's kit, etc. Whereas for this, it's very different being on home turf. I think everyone's got their own personal anxieties and concerns about themselves, their families, the individual personal things that they have lost, whether that's a holiday or whether that's something more serious. So there's a lot going on, and I think just having a bit of downtime for yourself to process all of that, and think about how you can, I suppose, be the best version of yourself, in what is going to be a difficult time for everyone.
Absolutely, absolutely, Beth, absolutely. So just looking at whether if people want to get in touch with you at all, indeed regarding anything to do with public health and/or snake bites, and/or your GP experience as an ST3, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so you're very welcome to get in touch. I've got a Twitter account, and I'll happily give people my email if they'd like to get in touch. And I don't know whether it's best to go through WEM or whether you want me to say it now. Either one is fine with me. So
Absolutely. Well, I think what we can do, Beth, is link it to the show notes so that people can get in touch with you, especially if they're thinking about going on an expedition
yeah,
in either tropical climate or to Southeast Asia or somewhere where you spend a lot of time, and taking an interest in snake bites. It'd be really good if they can get in touch with you. But we can tag you in the show notes so that people can tweet you
sounds
and
like a plan.
get in
Yeah, I'm
touch.
very happy to. If anyone wants to get in touch, more than happy to help and support people. I've certainly done a lot of asking people before I go off and do things. So I'm more than happy to help anyone.
Absolutely. Beth, listen, thanks so much for your time today and your perspectives.
No, thanks, Owen, and keep being a rock star on the front line.
Thanks, Beth. Thank you.